This is my second trial of a Tethys story. It's a sort of history of multiple closed oceans, which are now folded into mountain ranges of Asia and Europe. Tethys is actually the Greek name for the goddess of the oceans, I'm pretty sure. And the group of oceans, which are referred to as Tethyan, represent nearly 400 million years of history, starting back about then and almost lasting until today, you might say. Really the mother of all oceans. Now here's a representation roughly 200 million years ago. This is in the Mesozoic era, Jurassic period. It's actually 195 million years. We can see Australia there in red and Gondwana featuring strongly focused on the equator. Australia had only recently come out of an ice age, really, which we see at Hallett Cove, the so-called Permian ice age of 280 to 50 million years ago, which is the start of the Mesozoic era. Mesozoic, of course, extended through to the death of the dinosaurs at about 66 million years. So lasted from 66 through back to 250 million years. And that's really the major time of Tethys ocean developments. But we see here within the body of Pangaea, there's you might say, mouth opening with a lower jaw and front incisors represented by Australia. So a whole group of oceans opened by, you might say, slabs or rifts that occurred parallel to the northern edge of Gondwana, as shown there. Rifts that separated, formed new oceans and spread that section of Gondwana northward. There's one shown just under the word oceans there. There's a whole series of them crushing into the precursor of Asia in the far north there. And those have all split off from the northern rim of Gondwana, some from even Australia, certainly from Greater India, which is not shown there, a larger section of India, some of which has recently disappeared under the crunch of that jaw closing. I think if you can imagine it as the jaw hinged up near Spain or the Atlas Mountains of Africa, and Africa rotating anti-clockwise, then you can visualize how the last of the Tethys oceans was closed largely by India, breaking away from Gondwana and moving north with Australia, 80, 60 million years until its closure about 20 million years ago against Asia in the north. Hence, Tethys oceans are essentially no more. The only remnants of probably the eastern part of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, Sea of Aral, etc., in Eastern Europe and getting into Central Asia. Now I'll read this. A large ancient Mediterranean sea, first proposed by Austrian paleontologist Neumayer in 1883. Did this from the wealth of fossils, things like large single-celled forms, Ophiolites, which is prominent through, well, Eastern Mediterranean regions through into Asia, for example, in Oman and in Egypt. Massive limestones, which built the pyramids, incidentally, are composed entirely of these Ophiolites, up to almost centimetre in size, mostly about 4 millimetres or so, little lens-like bodies, very complex, but only single-celled organisms. Anyway, a wedge-shaped, east-facing Tethys within the massive continent of Pangaea was proposed by Australian geologist Sam Carey of Hobart, who worked a great deal on continental drift on a globe, and he realised the necessary extent of this ocean or these oceans. And as it says here, this ocean was later identified as a succession of oceans separated by north migrating terrains or continental blocks that split off Gondwana, one of which was Cimmeria. We may hear of that from time to time. These blocks were rifted off from the southern continental mass of Gondwana by the sequence of 3 or 4 new Tethyan oceans, which developed from the rifts. Their closure has resulted in the mountains of Eurasia. And here are some of those mountains, which do not even show those of the Mediterranean Alps, which are the real back molars, you might say, of the Tethyan oceans. There's the Pontic and the Taurus Mountains in the far west there in Turkey, Caucasus, with its strange bend around a small platelet. The Elburz just south of the Caspian Sea, the Zagros of Iraq and Iran, running down towards the Makran of Oman and turning north into the Hindu Kush. And there's the Permian Knot in the center of the picture, Tian Shan, the massive mountains extending easterly to China, Altai as we get up into Siberia, etc., the enormous body of the Himalayas, and this is not to mention those in Burma and running through into China, all of which really are the result of interacting plates as these oceans close to the northward. Here's a tectonic map. So the colours represent the ages at which the rocks were finally consolidated into land mass, or cratonized is another phrase we'd use. The older cratons dating back 1 billion years or so in India and Siberia are shown there, also extending across towards the Baltic over the Urals, which are in blue on the far left there, running from the top down halfway along the western border. But you can see the ages that these colours represent, and more particularly we're interested in ages from 440 million years, but I haven't included that in the blue line, although that's technically the ancient Tethys or Paleo-Tethys, bordering the craton in the north there, central part of the diagram in purples. And but the dominant ages running from 300 million years through 200, 150 million years, and 100 million years are all Mesozoic in age. So in the age of dinosaurs, this was an enormous ocean. And just exactly how it finished in the east, we do not know, because of the effect of the enormous Pacific plate, Pacific and Philippine plates, and the smaller Okhotsk plate up in the northeast corner, which is separated off probably from the North American plate very recently. Top section of that diagram in green is effectively on the North American plate today. So we can see crunched up into mountain ranges those sedimentary deposits which occurred throughout the Mesozoic era in Eastern Asia, Central and Eastern Asia. If we look here, we're focusing on the Persian Gulf in blue, and just an earthquake registered 5.4, which is a nothing in that sort of environment along the coast of Iran. But the Arabian plate here is moving north. The Eurasian plate not moving at any great rate, possibly gradually to the southeast, a very slow rate, but the zone of impact between the two is a closure of a relatively recent ocean, and in fact the change in colours from the blue of Persian Gulf and particularly out into the east of the peninsula of Oman where there is subduction going on in the Makran region, resulting in that BAM earthquake of 6.7 magnitude. And that's on lateral movement, which results from that slight southeasterly movement of the Eurasian plate and northerly movement of the Arabian. So there's one suture, we would say, older than today, but it's where most of the plate boundary movements are occurring. As you can see, there's an enormous crenulation in the Zagros Mountains running from Oman up on the southern side of that yellow line, whereas in the bottom right-hand corner, simple subduction is going on under the Makran. But looking at the areas of Afghanistan and Iran, Iraq, you can see how crenulated and crumpled the old ocean sediments are as a result of those previous plate movements. And we can see where the earthquake activity has occurred in the last 40 years, 45 years or so of the last century. A bit out of date now, but it's still current as far as earthquakes go. Big ones are represented as stars, others are represented by size and by depth. The shallowest quakes being registered in yellow, a few relatively deep ones associated with what has been subduction zones in the past, and movements way out in the Mediterranean, in the Hellenic arc south of Greece, greens and blues registered down to a couple of 100 kilometres depth. Suffice to say that it shows that region of, well, eastern Turkey running right through to Pakistan has been subject of an enormous number of earthquakes, and that's partly due to the rotation of a smaller plate, which is outlined by those earthquakes. Arabia is a smaller plate too, but it's separating from Africa, and separation is not as remarkable as collision, which is occurring on the northern edge or northeastern edge of that Arabian plate. If we look at it in detail, I suppose there's that main Zagros thrust, which is the plate boundary today, but there are a sort of symmetry in the age of deformation from the Caspian Sea to that Zagros belt in the south. And enough to comment on, but that's effectively the closure of the last of the Tethyan oceans. And here in the northwest region of Iran, there is an unconformity here which demonstrates the instability of the country. In the foreground, the strata dip at about 35, 40 degrees to the left or to the west, and a huge layer of limestone in the distance overlies this with an unconformity. That's always a demonstration of the instability of the region in which the unconformity occurs. The Tethys Ocean situation of about 80 million years ago, effectively, they referred to it paratethys, which was shallower water conditions separated from the major Tethys body to the south. You can see a red spot on the north of Iran where that last photograph was taken. And Turkey, the Iran region, had already essentially consolidated into a landmass undergoing folding and faulting as a result of the subduction, which was opposed. The red lines show that subduction in the north of Turkey was to the south, and in the south, Tethys was also subducting underneath it. So you had bipolar subduction there, crushing Turkey and North Iran. Whereas up in the Carpathians, you effectively had the Eurasian block subducting underneath the various little platelets that include Italy. Result was that Italy was a bit like a crocodile tooth sticking out from the jaw, and it was shoved northwards across the Alps, so that a thing like the Matterhorn actually has sections of African or Gondwanan continent sitting at the top. It's in its summit region of the Matterhorn, whereas the lower portion of the mountain is actually Europe. So the plate called the Ophiolian plate has been pushed northwestwards by the closing of the jaw of Africa. Looking in a little more detail at this region, we can see the Afro-Arabian platform. That's Arabia for the main part above the 1,000-kilometre scale there. You can see the Persian Gulf marked and the Zagros Mountains running up towards Turkey, Taurus Mountains, Pontonides in Turkey. Anatolian platform is Turkey itself, of course, and it straddles the zone between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, which are effectively remnants of different sections of Tethys, as is the Caspian. And these individual blocks marked in the middle were essentially zones that acted with a bit more stability than other areas, and a lot of the mountain ranges developed around them. It's as if they're microplates that have acted a little bit independently of the main crush. It's like chewing food as this great jaw of Africa closed on the Eurasian platform in the north. And that effectively is the remnants of two Tethyan oceans 20 million years ago, at the time that India started crushing into the Himalayan mountains. The whole of this Tethyan sequence was closing. And of course, there's many indications of intense folding quite near Tehran, one of the reservoirs. Beds are near vertical, thrust upon each other. If we start looking in that northern section around Loristan, for example, of the country of Iran, you can see evidence of this intense folding of the Mesozoic strata. This is what happens with the closure of an ocean. Subduction results in complete compression and shortening, and hence extreme folding of the strata. And again, an anticline in that same region of Khorasan. Working a bit, two more regions, Khorasan up there in the northeast, Shiraz in the ranges, can't even think of the name for the moment, prominent Zagros Mountains running up the northern coast of the Persian Gulf. And look at the earthquake epicenters there in the or along the Zagros Mountains. I can hardly read the, it says Zagros Mountains, it does, just west of, just to the left of the word Iran, and some very large earthquakes along the border to the north, which is probably more a slippage border than a subduction one, which is what is going on in the Zagros. You've got Africa sliding in underneath Iran, whereas in the north, you've got much more translation involved, like the San Andreas Fault, and the faults are very big but quite shallow. Now that very big star, May 20th, I think it's 57, not 37, and there's another one there up which could actually be 57 again in the far north, but they're very, very frequent, and most of those are in the same year. And every 5 to 10 years, there are huge earthquakes in that region of Iran through Turkey. Looking at the Zagros Mountains, though, rather interesting thing is that you have a bed of salt, which was kilometric thick, and deposited in the early stages of the rift, much as the East African Rift Valley today in its northern extension has a kilometre or more of salt evaporated from incursions of the Red Sea. In this case, salt domes occurred very early in the history of the Mesozoic, and they were at the bottom of the continental margin of Gondwana initially, and then through gravity they've risen to the surface and formed these very symmetrical domes because of the shape of the bubble, which is a bit like when you drop a pebble into mud, you get water into water, you get a structure looking like a lava lamp, a bulb at the top of a column. And that's really the shape of these salt domes, although they get elongated along the length of the deformed zone. And here's an oblique view just demonstrating that salt dome relief, buckling up the strata, particularly the limestones, and the black zones here are salt. It's actually exuded from the anticlines, from these domes, as essentially glaciers of salt. And you can see in the foreground, this black area, it's quite clearly been encroaching, a bit like a landslip. Well, it's just coming out like toothpaste out of a tube. And right at the 12 o'clock position, there's a small circular one just bursting through from the very center of an anticline. Again, around 4 o'clock, there's one too. Very, very interesting area. And our Flinders Ranges was like that 600 million years ago. So that's roughly the area down actually also in the Persian Gulf, but along the Zagros between Hormozgan and Shiraz. That's where these occur, or they carry right on through the Zagros Mountains to the north. And uplift, partly as a result of salt, but more distinctly as a result of the subducting slab during tectonic forces, has resulted in enormous gorges, beautiful exposures of Mesozoic limestones, very fossiliferous, dramatic all the way through the Zagros and running down into Oman. Oman is where we see that red dot on the Arabian plate essentially, and the reverse to subduction has occurred locally there. Instead of the plate sliding under, the Arabian plate sliding northward under, well, Baluchistan in that case, very west of Pakistan, the ocean floor has pushed up over Iran and comes right out over those Mesozoic limestones that we looked at before, a bit further north in Iran. And that's an extraordinary situation, but you can see the way the little black triangles are pointing that there are several sutures or zones where subduction is occurring in a northward direction, resulting in the closure of the ancient ocean. Blue patches along the northern border there, essentially the Black Sea, and an area east of that, which is not sea, it's more plateau today, part of the Iranian plateau, and but it obviously was ancient ocean, closed now by the effects of the subducting slab or slabs. Here is Oman, where that previous red spot was shown, and you see oceanic crust on the skyline, which has thrust right up and over these Mesozoic limestones. That's my grandson Harry walking up the track behind a couple of other geologists, and we say huge blocks of the Mesozoic continental margin sediments of the so-called upper thrust plate, because they themselves are thrust southward over the Arabian plate. And the oceanic crust is actually called Ophiolite. It's a recognizable sequence of crustal material for an oceanic area. starts essentially with dark coloured igneous rocks, gabbro. You tend to go up into zones of a lot of dikes, vertical structures in basalt. Then higher than that, pillow basalts formed by basalts exuded onto the sea floor, quenched to form pillow shapes, which just build up one upon another to give hundreds of metres sometimes of oceanic crust of pillow basalt. And the final sequence in an ophiolite is the deep sea sediment, starved of terrigenous or material derived from land. It's often just hematite-rich muds, sometimes silica deposits and manganese nodules, characteristic of what we see on deep sea floor today. So here's Harry again, looking at a section in that rock type, which has been altered somewhat from the gabbro to be serpentinite, and it's overlain by basalts. We're not able to see the dikes, obviously, in that, but that's typical of the sequence which has gone up to the highest points in Oman and have been dissected by enormous canyons, beautifully exposed in Oman. And that, again, is the location. So the Arabian plate is effectively subducting in the region of the Zagros Mountains, both south of them and north of them, and Iran, Afghanistan are broken up into microplates, which have rotated, as I said earlier, like chunks of biscuit or something in this chewing mass of the African, Arabian, Indian plates, pushing northward into the Eurasian plate and closing those oceans. That's every which way the direction of mountain ranges resulting from those smaller plates and their rotations. And I just say their mini plate edges control the mountain belts of that region. So now we can see the belt with just a few subductions markers against the Himalayas. In that case, the Eurasian plate is largely overthrusting the ancient block of India, which resists subducting because it's continent, and we get an enormous thrust zone there. Notice the dark blue trends ocean fractures. That's the spreading centres. In the case of the Red Sea, a new ocean which hasn't opened very wide, but out in the Owen fracture zone, which runs up into Baluchistan or Pakistan, it has controlled the edge of the Indian plate, which largely moved in association with the Australian plate until quite recently. It seems to be cracking off across the Indian Ocean. So a huge area of convergence is stippled there, which has closed ocean in relatively recent period, in the last 20 million years. We looked at the geological framework of Iran. There's the Central Plateau, the Great Kavir Depression, and the Great Sandy Deserts. It's surrounded by a triangle of mountain ranges named there. And these usually, the triangles result from the fact that the microplates are angular. So they've been rotated, twisted, etc., by the massive movements of the African Indian continents into Eurasia. And I suppose we speak of three geological provinces, that Zagros belt, folded remarkably in the last 10 million years or so, resulting from the subduction running along the Persian Gulf margin. And then in the center of Iran, Gondwana remnants, and in the north, much older sediments of the ancient Tethys Ocean, nearer to 400 million years, and fragments of Eurasia too, which show folding up until about 300 million years ago. These are the ones I didn't include in a very early diagram within the closed Tethyan Ocean. And one must realise that Mesozoic was a very prolific time for petroleum development, particularly in the limestones that we speak of. So in Oman, the oil production goes back as far as Ediacaran, which is 600 million years, some of the oldest oil in the world. But 60% of world oil passes through that narrow peninsula of Oman against Iran, so that you've got great stress on the maintenance of that seaway, particularly when we tend to irritate Iran. Here then is that belt. You see the Persian Gulf in white, and just see the tip of that peninsula that I speak of in Oman, and the Zagros folded belt with its linear zones paralleling the subduction, which is going on effectively just along that more northern border of the Persian Gulf, and also again in the Sinjan or Sirjan zone in central Iran, Iraq. And the central Iran plateau essentially is marked there as that blue area, getting up to the Alborz Mountains adjacent to the Caspian Sea. And they're relatively straightforward in that diagram, but as you go further east, there are blocks that have rotated and oriented the ranges northwesterly and even east-west in places. There's another outline of that closure of oceans. You can see it's in two parts with a fairly stable block. Central Iran there, although there's evidence of oceans having closed accurate bands of ophiolite around that central Iranian block, and of course through several zones that are quite closed today and just eroded mountains compared with the modern thrust zone shown in blue and the southern edge of the Zagros belt. So there's 3 or 4 evidences of closure of ocean basins indicated particularly by this particular suite of rock types called ophiolite, which are the ocean floor material that's been caught up in the fold belts. Here's some magnificent photographs again on the roadsides in North Khorasan, and some magnificent structures. Also, this is a synclinal nose, we would refer to it, because syncline in this case is plunging to the west, and the beds all dip in towards the central axis along the center of the photograph. But if you took the bottom of that bathtub, it would slope in to the left. So we refer to that as plunging to the west. And you can see red beds in the south dipping in under the sequence of strata that are so well exposed in the synclinal trough. And more striking scenery with folded beds indicating the extreme stress that much of this region has suffered in the last 50 million years, particularly the last 20 million years. And you can see just a location spot there for this Kerman region. Again, very pronounced unconformity, more or less related to the one I showed previously, with the limestones lying at an angle on the underlying strata. You see them, the underlying beds dipping at 40 degrees to the right, and the top beds lying just in a great arch, but more or less horizontally or slightly dipping away from us. And that would indicate a phase of folding and erosion that in this case occurred about 100 or 150 million years ago, possibly. Again, more of these folded cuestas, just showing the extent to which strata are deformed in that region. Here again, this is younger These are not Mesozoic, but just strata of about 20 million years old, maybe less, more or less the equivalent age of the Gambier limestone. But these two are highly deformed, and they include red beds, which probably indicate phases of aridity. The white strata would be clays. Darker ones very likely include volcanics or mudstones, and just enormous sequences that have been continental margin to the Arabian plate, caught up in the deformation and folded, as we see there, at angles of 30 degrees or so, dipping away from us. So Tethys is really a history of closed oceans. In the north, the Caspian areas surrounded the Eurasian stable blocks, and so they were quite separate until 200 million years ago, you might say in the upper jaw of the mouth. And there's even folding of those back to 350 million years ago. But these bordered oceans of Europe proper, which were precursors of Paleo-Tethys Ocean, which was much more prominent through Asia. The North Iran suture was a plate boundary probably around 250 million years ago, when the Iran plate was essentially part of Gondwana, but of course it separated and went north, and then we've now closed against it again, which is really remarkable when you think about it. But that's the story of oceans. And of course, another story, oceanic crustal rocks, these Ophiolites I mentioned, are pretty old in the Zagros, even though much of the deformation of Zagros is relatively young. There are zones of closure in there that represent ocean floors of 150 million years ago. So that's well within the Mesozoic era, when we had Tethys oceans closing one by one and pushing their way northward against the upper jaw. And we're saying they also surround the central and East Iran microplates at about 150 million year in the heyday of changes of Tethys. You'll strike, if you read it up, you'll find the Paleo-Tethys, Tethys 1, 2, and 3, or sometimes Meso-Tethys and Tethys 1 and 2, various names. And it's really difficult to work out what the authors are working with, as there's been no really strict, consistent terminology. And here's that statement that the Zagros Mountains represent the platform and shelf to the Arabian craton, although rocks sort of from 300 to 250 million years are missing, that presumably separated as a slab and went northward to be joined on to Asia, and has been brought back again and crushed into the complex of Central Asia. And the Oman Ophiolites are much younger, the order of 90 million years, when the jaw was closing further to the southeast, and one of the bicuspids or something or other in the front of the mouth crushed a little bit of oceanic floor and pushed it southwards up over the region of Oman. Here again is this tectonic map with the ages of the last folding or faulting of the strata given. It's not the ages of the strata so much as this gives you a picture of when structure occurred, when tectonism took place. So the pinks and orange of the Indian crater and the Siberian region are very old rocks. They may be several billion years old. But then around their margins, Ediacaran period, 600 million years. There were shallow seas, precursors probably to the real Tethyan Ocean, which then developed much wider jaw than is shown here. These are the crushed remnants, probably less than a quarter of the original ocean floor. And if you realise that the oceans were continuously subducting under the older craton Siberia, and sometimes southward too, at any given time when a new ocean was developing, there's an enormous amount of oceanic crust that has been consumed in the process of finally closing the Tethyan Ocean complex. I think it's suddenly finished. So Tethys is really the mother of all oceans. The sequence which we'll probably go into time and again, just to get some concept of mountain ranges like the Tian Shan and others that I've been fortunate enough to visit in recent years. And I think I'll leave the day at that and ask you to discuss questions. And if you have any serious ones, keep them or email me, and I'll attempt to answer them as soon as possible, perhaps in our July meetings. Thank you all.